Hello and welcome to a special edition of Football Today. I am joined by podcaster and football extraordinaire David Goss. David, how are you doing today?
I think football coverage extraordinaire, because the way you worded it made it sound like I'm actually a decent player, which is not accurate. So I just wanted to point that out. But I'm doing great because I got called a football extraordinaire. So it's a good start to the day.
Well, it's good to be with you too. Before we get into today's episode, I just want to highlight to our fans how this episode is going to be a little bit different. Instead of our typical interview format where I interview a guest about a specific topic and ask them a lot of questions, this episode is going to be a bit more conversational and a bit more like a traditional podcast, kind of like, binge mode if you listen to that. So today we're going to be going deep on the topic of the European Super League and tell you everything you need to know about it. And also, maybe get some perspectives and points of view that are a little bit different as well. So without further ado, let's kind of jump into what are the main talking points about the European Super League, at least what we found out last week. So last Thursday, the Times in England revealed new information regarding an 18-page proposal on a European Super League. So here are some basic details. The European Super League would have 20 clubs. 6 of those clubs would be English, and 15 of those 20 clubs are going to be permanent founding members, which means they will not be changing year to year. However, 5 of those teams will be changing annually. So 5 spots will be up for grabs. So this would be starting in the 2022-2023 season, and essentially we would have 2 groups of 10. So each group of 10 teams would play home and away against each other in the group, and the top 4 in each group would then play in a knockout style competition, much like we kind of already see with the Champions League. So kind of a playoff format style. And there are a lot of other details. Dave, can you kind of jump in and explain those?
All right. Speaking of Champions League, first thing that comes to mind is money. So why leave the Champions League and go to a European Super League? Well, even more money. The belief is that the 15 original founding teams will each receive £310 million each just to join this European Super League. And then the clubs could earn anywhere between 130 and 213 million pounds per season. Of course, the most going to the winner. Now, right before this Times report came out about the details of this European Super League, FIFA, UEFA, and the other international confederations made a joint statement last Thursday saying that they would blacklist any player from their competitions who played in this European Super League. So that, of course, includes the World Cup, European Championships, and then all of the championships in the confederations for international competition. This is unprecedented on a lot of levels, the biggest being UEFA and FIFA don't normally agree on most things. There was actually a belief that FIFA was backing the European Super League a few years ago against UEFA, but now it seems they're in lockstep against this competition.
Yeah, and there are a lot of really interesting developments about this, but just a couple other, big details. According to different reports, depending on who you read, it's being led by JP Morgan, which is a big bank in the United States. Manchester United, Real Madrid are kind of the 2 that have been getting a lot of the most credit for kind of starting this. And also AC Milan has been considered one of the other kind of driving forces behind these Super League plans. And of course, we know that Barcelona gave the okay before Bartomeu left. So, there is some support already, for this, and there's some clubs driving this. There's a lot of things to discuss, but first, let's get down to why are we hearing about this now, Dave? Why do you think this is news today?
So it seems, obviously, Josh, that a lot of this has been discussed for a while. This is not something that's coming together at the last minute, but with COVID and with what it feels like is heavy financial losses for some teams, the numbers we're seeing coming out of Barcelona are pretty substantial. Clubs are saying they're losing 70 million pounds on this season over the course of this year. Now is a time for them to try and use this as a way to try and create this tournament so that they can get the money. And it seems like you mentioned JP Morgan. Some of the research that I've seen around it says right now people aren't investing in many things because of COVID. So there is extra capital out there to get that upfront money. It believes it would be a loan between 4.6 and 6 billion pounds to this competition from JP Morgan that would then be paid off further going down the road. So it seems like now is a time for these clubs to try and create this advantage. We saw it with Project Big Picture as well. The big clubs are trying to use this moment as a way to sort of restructure things going forward.
And also, these financial institutions know that interest rates are at an all-time low. I mean, they can get as much money with as little interest kind of going forward. And that's always the best way to make money if you don't have to pay much back in interest. So it's not as much of a gamble for them to do it now. And, you mentioned kind of the loss of income. Here are just some pretty big numbers that we've seen recently on the amount of income lost by some of these big teams. Manchester United lost around $70 million or 70 million pounds in expected revenue. That came out in October. You said Barcelona. We're doing an episode on Monday about Barcelona. They are going to lose 97 million euros expected because of COVID. And the top 20 clubs, Deloitte just came out with a report, and they said the top 20 clubs are going to miss out on a revenue of around 2 billion euros by the end of this current season. So, I mean, we're talking about serious money that clubs are losing out on. And this is kind of their way, it looks like, of kind of getting that back. And let's be honest, they already wanted it before.
And that's the part that I noticed in reading through everything and looking at it is some of the stories I saw were from 2018 and 2016. And I saw a story quoting a book that was written in the 1960s about building a European Super League and how it will never happen, but it could happen and how it was so wanted. So this is something that I think the big clubs have always wanted. And then when you look at the details of Project Big Picture and you look at what the structure is, it seems like for these teams, there's a few things that they want, which is they don't want the ability to fall out of these competitions. So they want to be in Champions League every year. And that's one of the keys in this is those 15 permanent fixtures so that they will never get dropped out. And then they want more games.
It seems at the moment like they are leaning towards just replacing the weekday schedule. So this will replace the Champions League. And, just for some kind of, I think it's also important, we're talking finances and what could they get? And I do want your point of view on this in a moment. The typical season in the Champions League, these top clubs get between 70 to 100 million pounds. So if you're a Tottenham, if you're a Liverpool, you're going to make about 70, more likely 80 or 90 million pounds, your average Champions League season. There are a number of factors that go into that, depending on which country you're from and, how well you do in certain things like that. But that's roughly it. So you're talking about about roughly doubling the amount of money you could get by being in the Champions League, which, we should say is quite notable. But we can get into some of how feasible this is, but can we generate twice the amount of revenue by doing this? It seems a bit lofty to think that they can just make kind of double the revenue for this product.
Yeah, I think there's a few different trains of thought that you can take to get there. I think one of the main ones for them is if they're guaranteed a place, then they can invest some of that money earlier, which means the teams can probably be bigger, more star-studded, because they know their income going forward and it's not, well, we have to hedge our bets. So I think the biggest example in this would be a Tottenham. You don't have a fear of dropping out of Champions League, so you can spend at that level in the Super League, which they believe will make the competition even more glamorous, even bigger. And then you take away some of the group stage games that are less competitive, and you take away some of the teams that have less of an international fan base. And the idea is if you're always playing giant against giant game after game, there'll be such a large following that the money behind it is so big. Is that true? I'm not an expert. I don't know. But I think that's the idea behind it. Also, Josh, they're the only show in town at that point, right? There is no Champions League, really. Everyone's going to want to invest with this one property, which I think is where you see for the World Cup. They can get Coca-Cola to spend so much because you want to be the only soda company involved with the only competition everyone's watching.
But it's already the only competition everyone's watching on the weekday. I guess my question is, can you really grow that pie that much more? Or, how much of it is we're going to take some of the pie away from someone else? The Europa League or, some of these smaller teams that would get essentially commercial advertising. Like, some of that money has to flow, but it still seems to me a bit unrealistic. I mean, in terms of the financial, but then again, there's still so much more we would have to learn about that. So, that's a little bit on the finances of it. But something that is interesting about it is they did want to cap the wages at 55% of revenue, which, just as an example for people listening, at the moment, I'm pretty sure Tottenham would be the only English team, at least, that would qualify under that. And that's according to Kieran Maguire, who covers football finance. United are at 74% player wages to revenue. Liverpool are at 79% wages to revenue, and Chelsea are at 102. So those are all good examples. So it'd be pretty hard for them to get under that kind of marker.
But I would say, one, you're doubling your money you're making from Champions League. So that probably puts most of those teams under it. The other is, and we'll discuss this going forward, you are probably killing competition for some of these players from clubs outside of this because they can't spend on your level anymore. And so there's probably an extent where competing for a signing is going to go down because any club outside of these 15, maybe 20, won't be able to even financially get deals together or won't be able to say no to a sale. And so then you look at a team like Napoli. They can't hold on to Koulibaly. And so the number for Koulibaly goes down because there's no spot where they can say no because they don't have the financials and they're not playing in Champions League. So there's no payoff for keeping that player.
Yeah. But then, of course, you have 20 other or 19 other clubs, with a lot of money that can also spend for that player. So, I mean, players will be winning, at least the top end players will definitely be winning from this kind of sort of scenario. And that kind of gets down to the inequality. And, while we're talking about players, I think one of the big things from this week was how FIFA, UEFA, and the 5 other confederations all unified and came together and said, yeah, we're not okay with this, and we're going to ban players from major competitions like the World Cup, the Euros, and all the regional tournaments. What do you make of all of those organizations coming together and also saying we're going to blacklist players?
I think it's bold because if they call your bluff, now you're trying to put together a World Cup or a Euros without the players from the biggest clubs in the world and quote unquote the best players in the world because you've backed yourself into a corner. I understand for these organizations, especially when you look at UEFA and you look at the way that the entire, confederation is built and what Serafin ran on, who's the president of UEFA, was that he ran on helping the smaller countries get involved. And that's why you've got this Europa Conference coming up to split more money off Champions League and spread it around to keep other clubs and other nations competitive. This stands against everything he's fighting for, which is trying to keep more people included. So they kind of had to have that line. It's pretty fascinating that FIFA and UEFA are together on it. And as we said, it's unprecedented. I don't know that I can see it. I don't know that I can see FIFA saying their best players aren't coming to a World Cup. I mean, this is an organization that's trying to add World Cups and add more competitions and make the Club World Cup larger. So for them to then go and try and ban their own stars seems like it will never come to be, but maybe the point is you put out the press release, it gets the message through, and it kind of kills it before it really gets started.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. It seems very unlikely that FIFA would do that. I mean, it essentially cut its nose off to spite its face because, I mean, if you take away all the top players, it becomes like the Olympics, right? Where you have a bunch of great U23 players or something and maybe some notable players, but not many. And I don't know how much interest there will be in that. It seems like almost amateurish, if you compare it then to the Champions League or, the European Super League in this case. But there was a really interesting article I read about this, about whether the players would essentially be willing to go through with this. And it was by Rory Smith, and he was talking about the Pirate League in Colombia. And he, there's a quote in there, which I'll just read right now, that I think it kind of encapsulates it. He says, quote, "Ultimately, players will go where the money is, and fans will follow. The clubs of the Pirate League could pay their generous salaries only because Colombia stadiums were packed to the rafters. With a fragmented international audience, it is probably fair to assume the same would happen with the Super League." And I mean, that's kind of how I feel, is that if the fans are there and the clubs are there, like the players will be there, you know, like it's hard to turn down this money and, you know, hard to turn down the fans.
Yeah. So for everyone out there who doesn't know, Colombia was banned from FIFA in the 1960s. And so rather than just not really having a soccer league, they flipped it on its head and they went out and signed players from clubs because they no longer had to acknowledge ITCs, which is the International Transfer Certificate, where you need to acquire a player. So they went out and paid everyone they wanted, whatever they wanted, and brought them to Colombia. But it really only lasted for about 4 or 5 years. A lot of the European players didn't turn out want to live in Colombia after a little while. So that's the flip side. The thing I've seen about this, which I should mention, is so UEFA and obviously every confederation being a part of this, would you then be banning players basically not playing in the Super League? So let's say you're David Silva and you're in the European Super League playing for Manchester City, and then they buy another player and replace you. Are you now banned from playing for any club that's outside the Super League? Because technically you can't play in UEFA competitions. Can you play in Spanish FA competitions? Can you play in England FA competitions? So if you fall out of that team, would that player now be banned from playing for any club that's under the FIFA umbrella or any national team that's under the FIFA umbrella, which would change this calculus? Because then I think you really make it impossible for players to be a part of this, because the gamble is too large where, yeah, you can get a big payday, but if you're not a part of one of those 20 teams anymore, your career is essentially over. And then I think that probably kills it. But if the Super League's happening midweek and these clubs are still a part of their domestic leagues, then that can't be a part of the rule. And so you'd only be banning them from national team competition, which you could say is probably realistic. That for players, they would want to say, I'll represent Brazil in the European Super League and I'll win it for Brazil rather than playing for Brazil, which would be a sad day, but it's probably something that a lot of players would still say yes to.
Yeah. And also, I mean, you to a degree, then you kind of wipe out fixture congestion, which is another big issue of this proposal. I mean, they're talking about adding 18 games to an already, you know, domestic league. So you're talking about at minimum 56 games for these teams and these players, which, I mean, we're already in the midst of a season where player welfare is kind of one of the major talking points. And then for this to go, you know, really jump up, you need honestly this much amount of money just to pay enough guys to play on your team, because you're going to have all of these injury issues that we're going through right now. I mean, does it seem feasible with all of those games for this to happen?
Well, so I think that's why it's tied to Project Big Picture, because the proposal there dropped the Premier League from 20 to 18 teams, which takes away 4 games, and then takes the teams out of the Leagues Cup, which takes away whatever competition that is. And you'd probably see a situation where teams in this maybe wouldn't compete in an FA Cup. So they would try and skim off games going through that to maintain a level of it. But have we seen anything different? We're packing games in twice a week at this point during a global pandemic. And would you expect any less during a non-global pandemic going forward? Like, have you seen anything from these clubs or the people that run it, the people that run these competitions, where they've acted any differently than just trying to get as much as they can out of these players?
No, I mean, that has to be like, even like the biggest event of our lifetimes, this pandemic, even then it was take 2 months off and then let's plow through. And we have a number of players who have long COVID and whose careers might never be the same again. Alan Saint-Maxima, like, he might never be the same again. We don't know. But, you know, you mentioned before about how this would impact domestic leagues. And I think that is kind of actually the core issue, or one of the core issues in this. And this is why fans have such an issue with the European Super League. How do you think this would impact domestic leagues? And let's kind of walk this through of what could play out.
So I think the easiest comparison, and it's not perfect, is the creation of the Premier League in 1992 and then stratifying the haves and the have-nots. And I think the only way to look at it is now about 30 years down the road, basically every team outside of the haves is asking for a bailout from the haves. So there's no way, I think, to get around ending up there where all of these teams in Serie A, in the French league, in Germany, all of these leagues, those clubs falling even further behind these big few on revenue. And then you look at well, are the rights to the leagues as valuable? Because do these clubs care about the league competitions as much? Are they focused on it? If you're a network that has the European Super League, you're not even going to bid for the domestic leagues because that's, your pot and that's where you're going. So it just feels like as the game gets stratified between the haves and the have-nots, it'll just make it even larger. I think we have to put in the idea that some people have said, which is it'll actually make leagues more competitive and more interesting. These teams don't want to be there. Bayern wins every year. Juve wins every year. Let's take them out. You'll lose a big payday on those big games, but maybe you'll turn it into a competition people enjoy more. People want to be more engaged in. So there are arguments for how this could help people, and we do have to put those in.
Yeah, we do. Although, I mean, it all has to be said in terms of, in the current proposal as it is, they are not saying this is instead of the domestic league. So we have to assume that this is going to be in conjunction with the domestic league. And I think it would be that much harder of a sell, honestly, even though you might be right with those arguments. I think it would be a much harder sell for fans of those teams to all of a sudden turn their back on the domestic league and get them to sign up for that. I think like PR wise, that makes it very difficult. But if we do assume that they stay in the domestic league, you're talking about teams that have, you've already talked about the inequality that exists in some of these leagues. This year is kind of a crazy year in that we're not seeing as much inequality than we're seeing real title races. But, we could be looking at 3 teams in Spain, 3 teams in Italy have triple the money that the next highest team has. Not even just double, not even just like 1.5 times, like 3 times, 4 times. And that's when it gets really dangerous. That's when you start looking at these teams as like, okay, that's like the championship versus the Premier League. The gulf gets that big and they start getting better players. And to me, I think that's the biggest concern fans have is that inequality. And then it's like, what's the point, right?
Yeah.
You can't even sell hope. You can't even sell the hope.
I think it was a Middlesbrough fan group that sent an open letter to the UEFA president saying, like, as a fan of a team not even in the Premier League, it takes away the shine of getting there and playing against these teams when they don't even want to be a part of this and they're at such a level that we can't compete. And that's someone saying that where it's not even really maybe ever going to happen because they might not even be in the Premier League for the next few years yet. That's how fans are already seeing it down the road, which really hurts. And I think you put in our notes a piece that Tim Vickery wrote about Brazil, which was Brazil was a very local-based club scene because it's such a massive country. And so the state championships, and the country's broken up into, I think, 12 states, was almost the peak for clubs. And then they'd play in a national league for less games. And then, of course, in globalization and modern times, it's now shifted where the biggest clubs are in a national league, a Premier League, and they play against each other week in and week out. And those state competitions have diminished in value to them. And Brazil's even opened up secondary state competitions where the big clubs aren't allowed to play in it, like a Leagues Cup type thing, but they're actively banishing them to remain interesting and competitive, they believe. And the entire soccer scene is, I guess you can expect because of the way people kind of pick players out of Brazil, but it's so jagged and it's all over the place and it's not cohesive and therefore it's not efficient in any way. And that's kind of one of the worries that would happen, which is even if these teams remain in their domestic leagues, it won't matter to them. They won't care. And now you're looking at teams winning leagues because, well, they got, Everton wins the league because they got Man U the week before they were going to play Bayern in the biggest game, so they didn't start their starters. And Liverpool didn't care 3 weeks later because that was heading in to knockouts of European Super League, and that just changes the domestic league and changes the value in it.
Yeah, fundamentally, like this whole thing is about, and this kind of gets to some of our big ideas, which we'll get into in a second, but it's about trying to kill the competition, right? They are trying to kill the competition in their respective countries and kill the competition of anyone getting to where they already are as the top 20 clubs or top 15 clubs, if you will. So by nature, if you are trying to kill the competition, then there's not going to be as much competition and not as much consequence of playing those domestic games. And that's where you kind of get to the kind of weird thing. And that's also one of the dangers. And, maybe we should, before we talk about some of our big ideas, should clubs want to do this? Because once they enter this European Super League and everything is about the European Super League, as you mentioned, Brazil, you become one of 12 giant clubs. If you're one of 12 giant clubs, you are no longer a giant club. You are a mid-table team if you are the not 8th out of the top 20 teams or the 9th. Ask West Ham, ask, some of these other clubs if, mid-table makes you a giant still. How would these clubs take it? How would Barcelona take it if they got 9th 3 years in a row? So, I mean, Dave, do you think clubs should want this actually? Like, is this a good thing for clubs?
So I think at my core, I say no, but understanding for these people, it's about maximizing revenue and putting yourself in a more stable place. Their belief is they can build better teams knowing the income they're going to get. Not just the money number, but knowing consistently every year. And that, I think, is the biggest part for a lot of these teams. And hence why you see the comparison to American sports, where there is no promotion relegation. So you know exactly how much you can spend in 2024 and 25 and 26. And that helps you lay out better contracts, build better squads, build better rosters. And all of these teams then are going to believe that they can win this because they're going to believe that they're on level playing field with all these other teams, where currently I don't think Bayern believes they're on level playing field against the big two from Spain and the big clubs in England. Tottenham clearly doesn't believe they're on level playing field the way that they operate and the way that they use their transfers. So I think for these teams, your point is well made. And in Brazil, it's very obvious, like Botafogo, one of the famous clubs. They haven't won anything in a decade because there's no room to win anything. But at the same time, all these clubs will believe that they can win it for the same reason all the great players believe that they will start at every team they go to, because that's the mentality of these people and the way they operate.
All very good points. I think now is a good time to kind of get to kind of the, big ideas. These are the core issues and kind of some big takeaways. I think a lot of this kind of comes down to clubs want more money, and that's clearly the main driver of this. But unless it's shared with their national league, it inherently dilutes the quality and the competition of their domestic league. So it seems like there's kind of two opposing forces here that you can't really reconcile, one of which is these clubs want more money, and yet they don't want increased competition. And how do you repel that? How do you stop that?
I think it's the question every economist is asking about capitalism over the course of the world at all times. And again, I go back to the conversation around Project Big Picture, which is you had ownership groups of big clubs saying the full football pyramid is so valuable to why football is special, why this clubs can exist, why we develop great players. So we want to bail it out. But at the same time, it's our actions which have put them in a spot where they need to be bailed out. And so it's kind of this short-term, long-term conversation, which, again, I go back to the Premier League and saying the Super League teams are going to tell you why it's good for all the domestic leagues today. And there's some of the reports I saw which said there could be a level of kickback to each domestic league that has a team in this to try and spread the money, all those things. But there's a reason where we're at now. We're 30 years into the Premier League. So we can tell you where we'll be in 30 years after the Super League. But all of the ownership groups and all the people pushing for it are going to deny those things and say, no, we actually believe it'll make the sport better going forward. It's hard to see it from my point of view, but they would still say, well, if you pull us out of some of these competitions, then there's more for these teams to win. And there's more for those fans to get behind. And you look at when you do some of these secondary competitions and small teams get to a Wembley or get to play in a final in Spain or, play a final in Rome, that their fans do show up for those big games, even if it's against each other. So you create a scenario like that. I find it hard to believe. But I think that would be the sell from a lot of these organizations. I would ask you this, though, as a fan of the game, what is it that you want to see? Because we're both NBA fans, right? The NBA is a closed league with a salary cap. The best team we've ever seen, I would assume you'd agree, is the Golden State Warriors. It was only possible because players took less money to play on a team and be the best team. If we want to see the greatest in sports, don't we want this? Don't we want teams to be able to put together the best teams of the cream of the crop?
It's a great point. And, this is where I think part of the issue lies, is that European football for the last 10 years, the last decade, it's unquestionably better than it's ever been. Like, it just is. If you complain against that, then you can never really have this European Super League even conversation, because it's undoubtedly been the best quality football we've ever seen, the best, attacking. We've had some incredible games that, you'll never forget. And that's all due to this current, situation with the rules and everything. And so, you do have that on the one side, but at what cost? At what cost? And, and I think that those are kind of the core issues that we need to really grapple with. Do you have any final thoughts on this, or any big takeaways that you have gleaned from these most recent reports?
Well, my first was it was very hard to find to try and give you the pros as an audience, because this fairly firmly stands against what I believe in, both from an economic level and from a soccer level and football level. Sorry. But these teams believe that, one, this is more sustainable for them and to help teams around them. And they believe, I think, that competition point of view, which is we can build the best teams in world history and play them against each other week in and week out on the best stages, right? In the most impressive stadiums, on television, with all technology that you can put together. It feels like it's to spite everyone else, and it feels like to do it now is in a way taking advantage of a situation. We do have to mention, which I don't think we got to, that the current structure of UEFA Champions League is slated to change in 2024. That's the end of the deal they currently have, as well as broadcast rights and all that. And that's part of the reason this conversation's coming up, I believe, because it's all bargaining, right? And all of this is being done technically between reports and rumors, because no one's actually coming out and saying anything except this new FIFA statement, because this is all a bargaining. And so the big clubs, when they went into this style of Champions League with an extended group stage, they didn't want to have to qualify out of domestic leagues. They believed they should just guaranteed spots. UEFA said no. They made qualifying even larger, though. And the big clubs from big countries, they don't have to go through the rounds that an Ajax has to go through, where they have to do the 2-leg ties through the summer to try and get to the group stage. They automatically get there. So all of this, I think, is in the end a bargaining tool to get what they want out of UEFA and get what they want out of their domestic leagues. So I don't believe it'll happen in the end, is my point, or at least now or this time. But it does show you what these clubs want and what the people are thinking about, and genuine conversations that are happening. Florentine Perez went to Turin, I believe it was late November, and had an in-person 2-hour meeting with Agnelli, the head of Juve, about this. So this is a real thing that's happening. It's not just, a bunch of people on the internet that made this up. This is real, but I think that the end goal is to get more from UEFA and more from FIFA and more from their domestic FAs that these clubs want to make their, I think, financial realities more stable is the biggest thing. I think if Barcelona looks at it and says, we were the cream of the world 10 years ago, and now we're losing 97 million euros this year. We need to find a way to find something in the middle where we can then have investors that can trust in the money that we can produce for them and put ourselves on a more financial stable ground.
Thank you so much for joining us, Dave. Before you go, audience, if you like this little format that we just gave it a try for this week, just to see what it was all about and give it a go, please let us know. You can message us on Twitter, or you can also drop a message to footballtodaypodcast@gmail.com and let us know what you think. If you hated it, great. If you didn't, that works too. Fantastic.
But if you hated it, know this. Next time, we're going to eliminate all the other teams. We're going to move into a European Super League of podcasts, and we're only going to be the ones available. So that's your options.
Pretty much. And also, lastly, we have a new Football Today newsletter that will kind of give you some idea of what our episodes have been for that week. And we'll also be including a little bit more writing in that in the coming weeks and months. So please check that out. And you can see more info for that in the episode show notes or on Twitter. So thank you once again for joining us, Dave. And thank you for listening.